Welcome to CalSPRA's webinar on Decision 2024 when campaigning comes to campus. As you may know, this is a conference callback. That means that Meredith and William's session on these legal issues was incredibly popular at the spring conference. And if you've attended our conference before, you know there are usually 6 options for every time slot. So it's really difficult to get to all the things you love. And so one of the things the board decided to do was bring back the most popular sessions from the conference. And that is what we are doing today. And it is probably one of the highest registered webinars we've ever hosted as an association. So that tells me that we have a lot of questions when it comes to legal. With the November election approaching, we're going to have candidate campaigns, you're going to have general election, you're going to have maybe a bond measure. You might have questions about what the guidelines are for employee behavior and student behavior during election time. And probably a lot of our members may not have been in this field even 4 years ago. So this might be your first general election season that you're going through. Before they get started, let me embarrass them a little bit by talking about how fantastic our 2 presenters are today. William Tunick is a shareholder in DWK's San Francisco office, and he's chair of the firm's Board Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability Litigation Practice Group. That's a mouthful, but all very important stuff. His practice focuses on elections, governance issues, representing school districts in a variety of state and federal litigation. Leveraging his prior experience representing nonprofit organizations, candidates, and elected officials on issues involving elections, he specializes in working with districts on ballot measures. He also works with us on questions surrounding board member elections, including application of the California Voting Rights Act. So if you have questions around that act, this is your guy. He also advises clients on open meeting requirements of the Brown Act, handling public records requests. I know, I'm sorry you didn't want to hear that phrase today. And navigating school district reorganizations. So that will be one of our presenters, and he'll be joined by Meredith Johnson, who's a shareholder in DWK's Long Beach office, and she serves as chair of their public finance group. So we got the other side of the legal coin here as well. She focuses exclusively on educational facilities financing. She's a seasoned bond attorney with extensive experience in guiding school and community college districts through the complex financing and refinancing projects. And if you've ever had to communicate about bond finance, then you will be very grateful to lean on Meredith a little bit because it can get awfully complicated and in the weeds. She also serves frequently as underwriters counsel. She specializes in guiding school and community college districts through bond elections and ensuring compliance with legal requirements during those bond campaigns. So she can tell us what some of those guidelines should be. Post-election, she assists with forming and fostering productive relationships with oversight committees, ensuring transparency and accountability in the expenditure of the bonds. And she's often heard speaking at industry conferences across California, as Meredith and William both were last spring in Sacramento for CalSPRA. With that said, let me just tell you a little bit about how it will work today. They have a lot to share with us. We also have a great handout we'll give you at the end. So don't stress about taking copious notes here. It is being recorded, and we will send the recording out to everyone who registered for the event today. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we're going to try to ask them as we go along on the same topic. But if we get a little bit bogged down, I know they literally have this plan down to the minute, so we really have to keep things moving so they can get everything across. If I happen to have to stop it, we'll just make sure that I keep track of all of it and ask them at the end. All right. With that said, Meredith and William, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that very nice introduction. Much better than I usually do it. So that was very nice. And we also very much appreciate the invitation to join all of you and get a chance to talk about this topic today. I know we talked about it a little bit in March, but probably in March, November seems so far away. There were all kinds of things between here and there, and the election is definitely here. No two ways about it at all. And so, in case anybody forgot how many days away, actually, I was meant to do the math this morning. I think we're about 55 days away, somewhere in that range.
55, yeah.
Yeah. Good guess. So it's here. The questions are here. Definitely every 4 years, if not every 2 years, and usually about August, we start hearing questions about, what can the teachers do? What can the union do? A campaign wants to do this. We've got a ballot measure. What can we say? Can the principal send out alerts, all or updates? All of those types of questions start coming this time of year. So it is a very timely topic, obviously. I know you're all getting questions, and in your roles, I think in many cases you're probably going to be sort of in the middle of a lot of those conversations and questions. So hopefully the information we can share today is helpful. What we're going to try to do is cover about 3 or 4 kind of major topics. One being, what can districts do as far as informational activity when it comes to campaigns, what they cannot do, what's considered campaign activity. So Meredith will be talking about that. We're going to talk about the rules around employee activity, around independent organizations, so like unions, PTOs, that type of thing. Then we'll get into district facilities and what facilities can and can't be used for when it comes to elections. And then at the end, there's a couple of sort of related topics that are really important, including probably the only new thing that we really have this year. And that's just a little bit of a tease to get everybody to stick around till the end. And I'll talk about what that is. I think it's the second to last slide, but it's definitely worth sticking around for. So as we go through that, and as was mentioned, if there's any questions, we'll definitely try to answer them as we go here and keep this moving along. So where do we start with all this? This could be a very complicated area, and I'll just apologize both for Meredith and myself in advance by saying you probably will hear us say several times a day, it depends. And that's because it is going to depend a lot of times on the district and the facts and a lot of other things, but there are still some basic rules that we can start with here. And these are kind of the underlying principles that anytime we're dealing with election or campaign questions, we're really kind of starting with. One, First Amendment, right? So that means both not only the protection for the ability for individuals to express themselves in the context of an election, but also the prohibition on the public agencies using public funds to provide speech that maybe not everybody agrees with. So it actually kind of goes a little bit both ways. Most of the time we're talking about it in the context of the protections of speech. That other one, not taking sides, this is both a legal and I think a political principle here that's important for districts to remember. As a legal matter, we can't have districts taking sides in elections. As a political matter, it's something that doesn't ever go well. And even the appearance, I think, that a district or any public agency is really trying to weigh in on one side of an election or another tends to go badly. So we really do try to stay as far away from that line as we possibly can. Going down to that discretion, this is one thing I think that surprises people is actually, you'll see, especially when we get into the employee conduct and facilities, there's actually a decent amount of discretion left to districts to figure out how they want to, or if they want to regulate this type of activity. And so we'll show a couple of sample board policies. Those are places that you probably want to go take a look at and see what is your district, how is it exercise that discretion. So I think that's there. Last bullet point, and this is maybe not so much legal, is just something that we think is important. Ultimately, a school district, any other local education agency, is there to provide education. You're not there to conduct an election or support an election or really be part of that process. So we shouldn't have anything that's interfering with that basic educational mission. So I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really informed by kind of these 4 principles, and you'll see kind of how they show up in different ways as we go. So with that, I don't want to bury the lead too much. We'll move on. I'll turn it over to Meredith to start with a discussion about district resources.
Okay, so we are going to talk about what districts are allowed to do. When I say what is the district allowed to do, really I mean using the things that our public funds have provided to our district. What activities, speech, what kinds of things is the district allowed to do? Can I go to the next slide, William? So there is a very black and white underlying rule, and this may be one of the only places in this discussion where the rule is very black and white. And it pretty much is a strict prohibition, right? District resources, and the law actually uses the words funds, services, supplies, or equipment. Any of those things can't be used to help someone decide how to vote, to urge someone to vote yes or no, or to urge someone to vote for or against a specific candidate. And it's important to note that this rule applies in any kind of election, whether it be local, whether it be state, whether it be county. And if we're talking about both candidate elections, the presidential election in November, and any local bond measure that you may have on the ballot that your board has put on that ballot. It's a blanket across the board prohibition. Districts pretty much cannot campaign. Okay, that's an easy rule to follow. It's an easy rule to understand. It's a harder rule to follow, I'll say. We're going to discuss the intricacies of it and the application of it. But it's not a hard rule to remember. As William will show you later, oftentimes this rule is repeated in word for word exactly in your board policy. So not only is it the law, it is also the policy of your district. And so we think of this as a prohibition on advocacy, but this section in the education code actually goes on right after the language we've shown you in red to say that nothing here would prevent a district from providing information. So that's where the gray appears. How do we determine what is information and what is prohibited advocacy? Let's start by talking about the things that are prohibited. So we are all familiar with what campaigning looks like, right? You drive around your neighborhood and you see lawn signs all over. Clearly, that's campaigning. Yes on Measure M, that is clearly campaigning. A button, a flyer that says vote for candidate XYZ. Clearly that's campaigning. That's not hard to understand, that the districts are not allowed to use their funds, to use their resources, to use their printer, paper, copier, ink, computers, their website. Obviously, the district website can't have anything on it that's urging a voter to vote a certain way. That is the kind of stuff that we know not to do, right? So we say public funds can't be used to urge anyone to vote a certain way. That includes supporting the campaign in the background, right? You can't use public funds to pay for any of the campaigning, any of those kinds of activities, the lawn signs, the buttons, the mailers. That would be an impermissible expenditure of public funds. Another thing that's interesting, and this is, you want to go back, William? Another thing that I think is important to note, and this goes to the questions relating to employee activity. An employee during working hours is a district resource, right? So during working hours, your employees can't be working on the campaign. We'll talk later about what employees can do when they're not working, but you as a district can't release an employee to go work on a campaign when they should be working for the district. Next slide, William. So that begs the question, and it's relevant to all of you. If I can't advocate for the measure, but I can provide information, how do I know which is which? How do I know when I'm advocating, and how do I know when I'm providing information? So we have a little bit of guidance from case law that helps us understand when we're being informational and when we are advocating, although to be perfectly honest, it's not black and white. This is where the gray comes in, and this is where we need to make sure we're being careful. So the clues that we've been given are we should look at the style and tenor and the timing of our communication. And when I say style and tenor, I'm talking about, does the communication contain facts, or does it sound like it contains information that is trying to convince me of something? You know, as bond counsel, I oftentimes am provided with what's meant to be informational communications and asked to review it to confirm that it's informational. And one of my favorite things to ask people to take out are adjectives. When I see an adjective, it kind of sounds more like someone's trying to convince me of something. For example, on a bond measure, like FAQ mailer that's meant to be informational, if someone tells me that there are capital projects that need to be undertaken, they list the projects that we're going to spend the bond proceeds on, it sounds very different than if they tell me there are urgent capital projects that need to be undertaken, right? When you add in that word urgent, all of a sudden, I feel like I have someone's opinion. So the idea is that providing information is staying factual. If you're providing people with facts that allow them to decide how they want to vote, that's very different than with describing the need and describing why things are needed. And that also means that when you include the facts, you include all the facts, right? We don't pick and choose among the facts and include the ones that help our case or that make the measure or the whatever we're talking about sound like it's positive. We want to make sure that we're fairly presenting the facts in a way that allows the person reading the communication to make an informed decision, but not that necessarily urges a decision in any direction. And of course, timing, when you send out, your district may send out communications to your community throughout the year when there isn't necessarily any kind of election pending, and that's purely information. The closer you get to an election, the more it's going to look like it might be campaign material. I will say, though, that if you have some kind of periodic communication that you send out, that is a helpful fact when we look at whether your communication closer to an election looks like a campaign material or just informational material. If it's part of your ongoing communication plan, then it probably is more informational, assuming that you're keeping it neutral and you're fairly presenting facts. So what are ways that you can provide those facts to your community so that they can make an informed decision on their on the election that's pending? A lot of times districts will draft frequently asked questions, the kinds of things that they're being asked a lot, and put it on the district website, so long as those are factual. And I would urge you, and generally here we're probably talking about a bond measure or a parcel tax measure. I would urge you to run those by your bond counsel to make sure they agree that they are fair presentation of the facts, but assuming that they are, that's perfectly reasonable. And if you're asked by folks in your community, by local organizations that might want to help educate their members, I know November is definitely a busy ballot, and I'm sure there are lots of local groups who are trying to help people who belong to those groups with casting their vote. If you're asked by those groups to come speak, that's okay, so long as you're keeping the information that you provide to them factual. One way to do that, I think, is to provide both sides of the issue. When we talk about bond measures and parcel tax measures, there is a tax that will be levied if in fact the measure passes. So when you describe, in addition to describing the projects that might be undertaken or the programs that might be run if the parcel tax passes, if you tell voters that what the tax will be if the measure passes, that's a way to present both sides of the issue. And this is kind of an interesting, and it may seem like it doesn't necessarily follow the rules that I'm presenting, but it's okay for your board to adopt a resolution expressing their support for something that is on the ballot, whether it's your own measure, whether it is a county measure or a local measure, or the city that you are located in. And the reason for that is that if it is furthering the legislative goals of your board, it is okay for them to express an opinion that it does. It's okay for them to let the public know that from a legislative perspective, passing this measure would further the goals of our school district as well. There's case law that approves that. And then, of course, it is always okay to engage in activity related to elections that really is impartial, such as helping register folks to vote and urging folks to actually vote on at the election. So long as you're not telling them how to vote, as long as you're just telling them to actually go out and vote, that is always perfectly reasonable. So we don't get a lot of advice. The FPPC, for those of you who are not familiar, is the agency, the Fair Political Practices Commission in California that regulates elections. And they're the ones who will come let you know if they think that you have done something that isn't permissible during an election. They in 2021 provided some advice, and you'll see that the things that they mention are the advice that we're giving you. So it's important when you communicate that you keep the communication neutral, that you don't include language that seems like you're being argumentative, like as my example, calling a project urgent, right? The kind of language that makes it sound like you're arguing with someone and providing your opinion as to that information. You know, oftentimes, even the mailers that I review that are intended to be informational, they can look more campaign-like because they tend to have the same kind of bold letters and big colors and fancy pictures. Things like that are probably subject to higher scrutiny. It's important that the information that you provide in your community, when it's intended to be information and not a campaign mailer, doesn't necessarily look different from the regular communication that you provide to your community on your regular, communication plan. And as I mentioned, we don't pick our facts, right? It's important if you're giving a fair and impartial presentation of facts that you provide all the facts, not just the facts that seem positive to you. Another thing they said that was kind of new to our industry, William and I were a little surprised about, but that is I think is helpful. Oftentimes districts will engage someone to help them put their ballot measure together. And oftentimes once the measure's on the ballot, that person turns around and becomes a campaign person, and they don't work for the district anymore, they work for the campaign. So the FPPC actually said when that person is working for the district, they can sometimes, it can lead to the presumption that the district is actually campaigning and not providing information. So that's something to keep in mind, that when you do it in-house, oftentimes with your own folks, you don't run into that kind of gray area of, is this person actually campaigning, or are they trying to help us provide information? So no intention here to scare anyone, but just to let you know that it is important. It is important to follow these rules because the FPPC is watching. There are violations if you don't. Most commonly, it's a fine. Only really the most egregious, what I say, violations result in criminal penalties. I think, though, really, when we're talking about election season, there's a lot of publicity out there. And perhaps the worst publicity and the worst kind of penalty that you could sustain as a result of some kind of activity that kind of is in that gray area between campaigning and providing information may be the newspaper or some kind of publicity that somebody in the community decides they want to write about you. Especially when there are, there are no campaigns, and we're talking potentially about a bond measure, a partial tax measure. You don't want to let those folks have some ammunition against you. It's better to follow the rules, keep the district only providing information, and let the campaign folks who are separate and apart from the district, let them handle the advocacy. It's better not to get your name in the newspaper when, with accusations when they may or may not be true. William, I think I'm going to hand it back to you here to talk about employees.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. And when just to add on to what Meredith was saying about the publicity, of course, I always say everyone has seen the news article or whatever, the blog post that says, district being investigated for whatever it is. And it doesn't take much for that to happen, right? Somebody just files a complaint and then they start an investigation. You never see the one 6 months later that says, after further review, it turns out district did nothing wrong. And so it's unfortunate, but that's why even just getting close to that line can be problematic. So it's definitely one of those things where you want to work with someone if you've got a measure on and you're setting that stuff out. So I mentioned one of the other things we wanted to talk about was district employees and their activity. And especially when we have candidate elections happening, this tends to be another area we get a lot of questions about. So I mentioned the First Amendment at the beginning. We'll come back to that here. Obviously, district employees and officials don't lose their First Amendment rights just because they happen to work for a school district. So they are still free to express themselves, campaign, make contributions, do all the things that anybody else could do. But there's always a but. Um, to the point Meredith made earlier, they can't use district resources to do any of those things. So that means district time. That also means if we're not on district time, still using district resources. I mean, email is kind of the easiest one to always point to, but even something like using, the computer or the software program or whatever, even if it is after, 5 o'clock, for example, that's can still be a use of district resources. So that becomes problematic from the district's position, even if we're saying employees outside of work can do, may participate in this type of thing. That also extends to endorsements. This is both for board members, officials, anybody else. They're not prohibited from endorsing candidates, measures, anything like that. The one thing that we want to do, though, when we do those endorsements is indicate that the endorsement is being made by the individual and not by the district, because the district can't endorse candidates for one thing, and only limited, as Meredith mentioned, as far as ballot measures. So a lot of times, and I'm sure you've all seen this, the request is if you're going to use the title, something indicating the title is being used for identification purposes only. So you'll see that on a lot of campaign websites as it is. That's why that's there, so that in theory we don't have confusion over who's being endorsed by, or who's doing the endorsing, I guess, the district versus the individual. Also, a lot of protections. You probably wouldn't be surprised. This is that same part of the education code that prohibits the use of district resources, but it also goes on to say that we can't have restrictions on political activities of officers, employees. They can't discriminate against somebody because of political acts, opinions, affiliations. Nothing really surprising there. I think you would all assume that's what it said. Also, that district officers and employees can't use or can't influence someone to urge or discourage certain political action. The reason I like mentioning that one, and this is a question we get a lot kind of on the district campaign overlay, is when we have campaign committees that maybe, especially in smaller districts, where we might have the superintendent and board member of the CBO who want to act as the chair of the campaign committee or run the campaign committee. And and the question is, can they do that? Well, technically you can, as long as you don't use district resources. There's nothing saying they can't do that. The problem, I think, is a lot of the practical implication of that. So for example, if we have a superintendent or a board member who's doing that and they're asking for contributions, and they're asking that of employees, it's not too far before we start running into this rule, right? There's also, when we get board members involved, we get concerns about Brown Act as far as having multiple board members on a campaign committee. So there's a lot of reasons why usually our answer to that question is yes, you can do it, but there's a whole lot of good reasons why it's probably not a great idea, and we recommend against it. It's better to have a very separate campaign with separate individuals, separate and apart from district employees and officials. If they want to go out and knock on doors and be supportive, that's fine, but it's best not to have them be the campaign committee organization itself. So again, though, otherwise pretty broad protection, at least when we get outside of district time and outside of district resources. The flip side of that, and this is what I'm kind of just alluding to, is that the education code does say that boards can establish rules prohibiting political activity during working hours and on the premises of a local agency. So I mentioned before, there's a little bit of discretion here. This is kind of what I was referring to, which is that it allows the district to prohibit these things. For the most part, districts pretty universally do prohibit this, both because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, I think when we talked about at the very beginning, this idea that the school district is there as an educational mission, not a place for campaigning necessarily. I think the other issue that you can run into with why a lot of times, if there's a choice about whether or not campaign activity is going to be allowed, the answer is usually going to be no, is because where you can run into trouble with that is any sort of discrimination or allegation of discrimination, and any inconsistency with how access is provided if you do allow for some of these activities is going to come back at the district as some sort of discrimination allegation. So it's easier to say, no, we won't allow it at all, period, as opposed to yes, we will, and then we're going to have to make sure that we apply it evenly to everybody, even if there may be some opinions or campaigns that are less popular than others. And so that ends up being a good reason for why most districts do prohibit it. If you, I was going to say, what we mentioned before, if you look at your board policies, for the most part, you're going to find them these two places, and I think these are kind of the CSBA standard areas that you're going to find it. But again, for the most part, districts are going to be prohibiting this activity. I would take a look at these policies, see if you think they need to be clarified. You may have sort of additional documentation that clarifies exactly what the district's position is on these things. But you do have the authority to prohibit that type of activity during working hours and on the premises of the agency. Again, that's not really the purpose of the school district or really any local education agency. The one other area, and I know I'll just kind of give an example, this is of how these things all come together, about, you know, does the district really have this authority? Political buttons. There's actually, of all the things in this area that we talk about, there's actually 2 cases that talk about buttons and teachers wearing buttons. And what they very specifically say actually is that the district may prohibit buttons, political campaign buttons, from being worn during instructional time. But on the contrary, they say that you may not prohibit it from being worn during back to school night, for example. That was actually the case. There were 2 cases. And the distinction that those, one was an attorney general, the other was a court, but the distinction they made was, in the one setting, it was going to be difficult for students maybe to differentiate between the district speech versus the teacher speech, versus back to school night, where the parents would be able to make that distinction. I think there's also a little bit of a distinction there between just instructional time and what the purpose of that is versus back to school night, for example. But that is the rule there. So again, when it comes to that instructional daytime, if we're talking about teachers especially, most districts pretty strictly prohibit any sort of campaign activity, and that is legal under these authorities. Once you get outside of that, if we get off campus, we get outside of duty time, then for the most part, those restrictions aren't going to apply. And as long as someone doesn't use district resources, they're free to participate in campaigns as they wish. The one other thing I was just going to mention here, because it does come up from time to time, is what about board meetings? And either where you might have board members or either members of the public coming to board meetings and using public comment to talk about campaign topics, for example. It's a pretty tricky area, because what the Brown Act says, kind of just moving into another area of the law, is that, you know, board meetings and public comment have to be about matters that are within the jurisdiction of the board. Technically, elections are not within the board's jurisdiction, but they tend to be about topics that are. So if somebody shows up and says, I think we should all elect this person because I think the district needs to work on A, B, C, and D, and they'd be good at it, they've kind of mingled those 2 things. I've seen boards say we're not going to allow that type of speech. I think for the most part, you're going to spend more time arguing about it than you would letting the person have their 2 or 3 minutes. But I still think board presidents can remind public and maybe even other board members sometimes that, you know, this isn't necessarily the appropriate place for campaigning. This should be where we hear public comment about matters that are really within the board's jurisdiction that the board is looking at, and not so much, you know, there's other forms for campaigning and election speech. So that's one other question that we do get this time of year, because I know that is happening out there as well. So I wanted to, I think, turn it back over to Meredith, I think, do I turn it back over, or do I keep going? I should know that.
Keep going. What's the next slide?
I keep going. Oh, we went. Sorry, I thought we were facilities. We're not facilities.
Yeah.
Independent organization. So I keep going. I get this one too. So we've kind of talked about employees. An extension of that is some of the organizations, PTOs, foundations, unions, and what can they do? I would start by saying there are restrictions on those entities as far as the type of campaign activity that they can do, how much they can do, what exactly they can do. It's different for ballot measures and campaigns. Those are all generally tax law questions that is that are really the purview of the PTA or the foundation of the union to deal with. They're not really a district question. We'll get those sometimes, and for the most part, we'll send, you know, if a local PTA says, can we do something? Is this going to impact our tax exempt status? A lot of times we'll send them back to their regional PTA office and say, you know, you really need to check with them because that's your tax exempt status. We can't really advise you on that. So that's one thing you can do if you start getting those questions. But the thing here to look at is, notwithstanding that prohibition in 7054 that we talked about at the beginning about the use of funds or services or equipment, this says that notwithstanding that, the use of a form under the control of a governing board is allowable as long as it's made available to all sides. So we'll talk about sort of form and the facility piece here in a minute. Meredith will talk about that. But forms can also be channels of communication. So in other words, a district may allow its communication channels to be used by someone else to send that type of information, even campaign information. For example, mailboxes was what the question used to be a lot. The reason that we don't see it too much is because if you do that, you have to allow essentially all sides to use that communication channel. And that again can create a problem because maybe the first time somebody asks you to do it, it's something that seems popular, and the second time you get asked, it's not so popular. Once you've opened the door, you can't close it on the second person. Otherwise, that becomes viewpoint discrimination, which is pretty much prohibited. And so that's why, for the most part, most districts, even if they have discretion to allow it, they tend to not do so. And again, going back to the other point we talked about at the beginning about sort of the educational mission of the district, again, do we want to have that type of messaging getting in the way of other things that the district is trying to communicate? So technically allowed, but generally most districts don't allow it. And again, you might look into, I think we have in a few slides and other references, some board policies where you'll find that type of prohibition as well. Last thing, of course, you won't be surprised, but unions have slightly separate rules about what they can and can't do. Generally, that same prohibition applies as far as the ability of the district to regulate or prohibit campaign activity during working time on district premises. They do have a small carve out that allows them to solicit contributions for certain types of ballot measures during non-working time. I don't know that that comes up that often, but it is in there. And these things do end up with PERB. There are, you know, I think unfair practice charges that are alleged against districts. And what the PERB has pretty much said is you can't stop a union from talking about campaign related items at a union meeting. You also, there's actually, I think, a couple of cases that deal with what can happen in district parking lots, but PERB has gone so far as to say that you could prevent someone from having I think the sign is larger than the car or something like that in the back of a pickup truck. And they said you can't do that in the parking lot. Bumper stickers, maybe a different thing, but that they said you can't do. So again, the union's got a little bit more leeway when it comes to campaigning, and this is going to usually be candidate campaigning than maybe others will. But again, those same basic prohibitions about the ability to prohibit the campaign activity during working time, district premises, are still going to apply pretty much across the board. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Meredith.
So you may be getting requests to use your facilities by folks who represent campaigns. Do you have to let them use them? Can you let them use them? Is it a good idea to let them use them? The first thing I'll say is that you probably have some kind of policy in place for use of your facilities. Stick to your policy. It's important that, and this goes to what William talked about earlier about not taking sides. There's no real reason to let any particular campaign organization use your facilities. There's not necessarily reason to deny them. What I will say, though, is that oftentimes you will have a board policy that talks about this. So make sure you look at your board policies and follow them. They probably say something very similar to what William talked about with the forums, that if you open up to one side, you have to open it up to all sides. So make sure you're complying with that. And really, there's not necessarily a good argument to do anything other than just to follow the policy that you use every day when someone asks someone asks you to use your facilities, right? That way you're staying neutral, you're not taking sides, and you are simply following what your board policies say and following what the general policy of the district is. The only thing I would say is that if for some reason there is some campaign behavior that you just think goes beyond or is egregious and you don't want to let happen on your campuses, that would probably be the only exception. And if you were to deny someone, you might have to consider denying anyone who asks, just to make sure you're staying neutral. Next slide. So William already mentioned mailboxes, and that tends to be the most common form of distribution channel that a campaign might ask for. You might get asked by one of those other organizations like a PTA, PTO, or a union. They may have some kind of flyer that they want to pass out to teachers, that they want their teachers to know about. And they may ask if they can use those mailboxes, particularly at school sites, if they can put the flyer in that mailbox. If it's campaign material, I think this cuts too close to home. It looks too much like using district resources, that mailbox, to campaign, right? Because you're allowing district facilities and things that were paid for with district funds to urge a voter to vote a certain way, or to urge support for a measure or for a candidate or for whatever it is. I tend to think that the answer to the question, can I use the elementary school mailboxes? The answer is probably no. When we talk about resources, things like email and servers and even things that you can't touch, those are district resources. So it's never a good idea to allow any of those folks, anyone who might request to use your distribution channels, to use your email or your website. Of course, we can talk about old school bulletin boards. If there's a bulletin board in the teacher's lounge, for example, you should not be letting those organizations who are doing campaign work to use any of those distribution channels. That looks like district resources for a campaign. If for some reason you were to allow someone to use one of those resources, again, keep it open to both sides, but I'm strongly urging you not to allow that use. There are some board policies, and you can copy down these numbers. You'll get a copy of this PowerPoint when it's over, because these are the most common board policies related to these topics, and you probably have them. They all originate from CSBA, that talk about all of these election-related district facilities usage or activities on our campuses. So there's AR 1330 that limits use of district facilities, and it does say that you have to comply with Civic Center Act. It probably also says that if you allow a facility for one side of the campaign, you have to allow it for the other side of the campaign. Board Policy 1160 is very similar, and we uses the term forum, which, as William mentioned, can be either a channel of communication or a facility. And it again says, don't take sides. You have to make sure you're providing it to anyone on an equitable basis. So if one side asks, it's important that you provide to the other side as well. And then BP 1325, which actually may contain a prohibition on campaigning or distributing campaign materials on district property. So I urge you just to go back and look and see if you do have these board policies, because it's helpful to know what your actual district policies is. With that, I think I'm going to turn it back to William.
Yeah, and just one thing, actually, you reminded me, I should have mentioned everyone's favorite word, the PRA, but when on the email distribution thing, I know that districts will get PRA requests from campaign committees or others for information that they're trying to use for campaign purposes. Just treat those like you would treat any other PRA request. I wouldn't treat them differently because you think they're from one campaign or the other. If somebody asks for information Even if, quote unquote, it's a friendly request, I'd still make them go through the formal PRA process so that in case somebody ever says, well, you were trying to favor this side by giving them information you didn't give everybody else. It's, well, they made a PRA request, we had to respond to it. So I would make sure to just, treat those like any other request, regardless of what the purpose is. So, one other just slide before we get into these additional kind of prohibitions. I think one thing, this is a picture from not California, and I think the idea here is kind of a photo of what you, I think, want to avoid. And this comes up in a couple ways as far as what really is the role of the district when it comes to elections. Districts don't really have any role in elections. You may get asked about, is this candidate eligible? Why are they campaigning over here? Why are they doing this, that, the other thing? And the answer to most of those questions is that's not really the jurisdiction of the district. The elections are run either by the county register, maybe a city clerk. Enforcement is usually the DA or the FPPC, as Meredith mentioned. And so those are the places where if people have complaints about things that are happening off campus, that's really where they go. It's only if something is really on your, either using your resources or on your premises, where the district's going to get involved. And as a matter of fact, like I said at the beginning, I think you want to try to stay away from getting involved as much as you can, because it's pretty much never going to go well. So that's, I think, one important thing we'll talk about in a minute, but making sure that not only your officials and employees, but also candidates, campaigns, they understand what the rules and limitations are. That helps getting some consistency. And again, just not having it interfere with the educational mission. For the most part, if somebody is standing on the sidewalk across the street from the school, they can do whatever they want. Although I have seen situations where if that's getting to a point where it's interfering, for example, with like drop off in the morning or something like that, we've seen districts ask folks to move, and I think you actually could make them move if they were getting in the way. But hopefully you don't have too much of that situation. The other thing that I'll just mention here, because I've got a couple questions about this too in the context of candidate elections, is what, from a communications perspective, how to address situations where maybe there's a candidate campaign going on and maybe there's misinformation or things that are being said as part of that campaign that the district maybe doesn't agree with, and is there any sort of response? And the answer for the most part is nothing direct. We don't want to have districts saying, well, candidate X said this, but it's really A, B, and C. I think, putting out neutral information through your normal channels about, there've been some questions, here's some information about this district program, this, that, or the other thing, and keeping it as neutral and kind of just unbiased as you can. It's probably about the farthest that you can go. I know that's sort of a frustrating answer sometimes for folks, but again, anything that's going to look like the district is taking sides is, I think, really going to end up backfiring on the district at the end of the day, and may also be illegal on top of that. So I promised as we get to the end here, we get to a couple of slides I wanted to make sure that we covered. And these are prohibitions that are sort of related to campaigning. They're not, one is more related than the other, but something that I think everybody should be aware of. First one of these is the prohibition on mass mailing. And I'm going to start, before anybody gets too much of a heart attack on this one, by starting at the bottom of this slide, where it says this does not apply to email. So everything I'm about to say does not apply if you send email. This only applies if you send hard copy mailers, printers, communications, whatever they are, in the mail to more than 200 people. If you do that, you have to be very careful, because there's a prohibition that says you cannot do anything that features elected officials, which means your board members. So, for example, this mailer that we've got up here, this is from outside of California. This is the kind of thing that probably the FPPC would take issue with. It talks about board members, it has their pictures. I've had the FPPC take issue with somebody sending out a mailer that had an update from a board president. And it was just, I'm the board president, this is what's going on. It got sent in the mail, they got a complaint, the FPPC came after them. So this is one that it's kind of hiding out there. And I think since so much communication is electronic, we don't talk about it that much. But I do like highlighting it anytime we talk about campaigns or anything involving the FPPC, really just to remind everybody this prohibition is out there. If you're doing anything by mail. It's only elected officials, so it doesn't affect the superintendent, unless I guess you've got an elected county superintendent, but not in school districts. So that is one thing to be aware of. The other thing, and this was the hook at the beginning. So this is something that it's new and it's not new, and that this is a change in the law that we got. It was actually the beginning of last year, but we didn't really have much of a campaign cycle last year because it was off cycle, essentially an odd year, right? So we didn't talk about it a lot, but we're talking about it a lot this year. It used to be the case that when we got asked questions about campaign contributions and conflicts of interest, the answer was always, those are pretty much separate. They're not conflicts of interest. They don't count in the same way that a lot of the other types of conflicts work, basically. They don't work the same way. The legislature changed the law last year, and now there are some implications, kind of conflict of interest type implications for campaign contributions. And they fall into two buckets. One is, and this is usually more relevant to school districts, is around solicitation of contributions for ballot measure committees. So what this law now says is that a board member and a superintendent, it doesn't apply to other cabinet or employees, so it's only that level, but that someone in either of those offices may not solicit contributions of more than $250 to any measure committee at all. Doesn't matter which committee it is. So in other words, if there's a bond measure or a parcel tax and they have a campaign committee, if someone is soliciting a contribution of more than $250 to that committee, that's where this can kick in. It applies to anybody, or it prohibits that solicitation to anyone who's been basically in front of the board for some sort of decision within the past 12 months. For school districts, that's pretty much going to be contracts. This rule applies to all local agencies, so that's why they talk about proceedings. But school districts, pretty much going to be contracts. So what this is essentially saying is if somebody, and then important caveat, doesn't apply to union contracts, but professional services, independent contractors, that type of thing. If they've been in front of the board and had a contract approved in the last 12 months, the board member or superintendent cannot ask them for a contribution of more than $250 to a ballot measure campaign. It used to be, until last year, you could do that, or board member or superintendent could, as long as they did it own time, own resources. They go sit in the parking lot after work and use their personal cell phone. That was fine. Now the answer to that is probably not. Now you could go through the trouble of figuring out which entities and which individuals had contracts and which didn't. But I think practically what this means is it's best just not to have board members and superintendents making those solicitations anymore. It should really be independent campaign committee members, maybe other district employees if it has to be, but definitely not board members or not superintendents. So that is basically a new rule for this campaign cycle. The corollary, which we don't deal with as much, but just so that you know it's there, is that same rule applies to candidates. So if the board member is running for re-election and they voted on a contract for somebody in the past 12 months, they can't accept the contribution from that person. There's also an additional prohibition for candidates, doesn't apply to ballot measure campaigns. If a candidate receives a contribution of more than $250 for this election cycle, and then in the 12 months, sorry, not 12 years, going forward, that person has a contract that comes up, the contributor does, before the board member can't vote on it. So it acts like a financial conflict of interest for 12 months after they've accepted the contribution. So it's even more stringent for the candidate campaigns than it is for the board measures, bond measures, excuse me. But both of these things are out there. They're a little bit new. I think probably it's going to confuse a lot of people because it's the first time that we've been doing it. But I wanted to highlight because those are out there as well. So a couple of best practices, and then if we've got, I haven't seen any questions pop up, but if we have any here at the end, I'm sure we've got it. Looks like we might have a couple minutes to talk about those. But best practices. So really kind of the first three across the top really go to that bottom left box. We've shared with you a couple policies today. Take a look at them, understand what they are. If they need to be clarified, maybe a little bit late this cycle, but it's a good thing to do for the next cycle. Get that information to employees, candidates, and campaigns. As was mentioned, we've got a one-page handout that's meant pretty much for distribution to employees and others. It's real basic, just reminders about the prohibitions. Sharing that information, oh, there it is, perfect. I think is really helpful, both because it just educates folks. Also, if a candidate or an employee does something that they're not supposed to do, it's always helpful for the district to be able to say, well, we put this information out, right? You can't stop everybody from doing everything, but we put this information out. We told everybody what the rules are, and they did it anyway. But we had tried to inform everybody in advance. So I think that's another good reason to send it out. Having a single source of information, which may be a lot of the folks on this call, adding to your workload this time of year, but it is really helpful to have a single source or person answering questions just from the consistency standpoint. So that goes to that bottom left box, which is, know what the rules are, tell everybody what they are, have one person answering questions, and that's all going to help you be consistent and avoid any sort of allegation that your viewpoint, that you're discriminating based on viewpoint, which is what you don't want to have happen. The informational material, Meredith spent a lot of time talking about that. It's a really tricky thing to do. We pretty much have to review everything word for word. So if you're doing any of that, even if you've got, like I said, principals sending out updates about an upcoming bond measure, an election, I'd be running those by council just to be double sure before anything goes out. Last thing I was going to mention, and this probably just goes for every single presentation we do, and I'm sure you've all heard this one before, but is be careful with use of district email. A, it's a district resource, and B, it's also can be subject to PRA requests, as you all very well know. So, and I think it's particularly tricky here because you might have somebody who's doing on their personal time campaign work. Maybe they have both email accounts on their phone and they're using it by accident, right? So just being really careful about the use of district email and keeping that separate from anything having to do with campaigns. So with that, unless Meredith, if I forgot anything, we almost landed right on time. But I know if there's any questions, we're happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, guys. I actually had one quick question. I believe it was a section that Meredith covered early on about if we decide to launch a new communication tool, try not to do it too close to an election. Can you tell us what too close, what that range looks like?
So I'm gonna, you're right, I did say that, but I do think that so long as we're being, and I have told clients this cycle, so long as you run it by your counsel, so long as it is informational and it doesn't necessarily look like a splashy ad that someone could confuse as being some kind of, campaigning publicity. So it's okay. I think when we talk about getting too close to an election, it's like I said, it's not black and white, it's very gray. So it's kind of an accumulation of all the factors. So long as we can look at all the factors and they all really point to a fair and impartial presentation of facts, I'm okay with sending out information prior to an election. I'm working with a client on a parcel tax, and we're going to send out a mailer that informs voters that parcel taxes have a senior citizen exemption. And it's really going to be very factual and just let people know that if you are worried, if it's not going to say these words, but it's the point of the mailer is to explain to the community that there is an exemption for seniors and that this measure is a little more fair in that fact. And therefore, if you can approve it and not worry about the seniors in the community having to pay for it. But I'm okay with that going out right before the election. And in fact, I almost feel like it's almost a little bit of a PSA, kind of a public service announcement that, folks should understand that seniors don't have to pay for this parcel tax if in fact they're worried about that. And that could be a reason they'd not vote for it. But I consider that information. So I don't have a timeline, and it's more a matter of what are the aggregate factors that go into the communication. And as William said, it's really important, let your counsel review it. That's your last stop before it goes out, so that you know that you have their blessing. It's probably okay.
And we did get another question in the chat from Sarah Rath at Pastor Union. Can board members endorse candidates using their title, which is then used on the candidate's social media page?
So technically yes, but what I would usually recommend is, and on social media, it's going to be a little bit trickier. Some sort of indication that the title is being used for identification purposes only. So, you might have to be in parentheses. A lot of time on endorsement pages, you'll see the asterisks on a lot of the names, and then at the bottom it'll say title for identification purposes only. So I'd recommend something like that.
Makes sense. All right, we have come to the end of our time, and I know that our folks are super busy. I want to thank Meredith and William so much for coming back. I can see why your session was so highly rated. There is a ton of great information in here, and I know that all of our members will be smarter for having joined us today or watching the recording. Before we go, I would like to introduce Jessica Hull, our amazing past president here at CalSPRA, and she is going to share with us some upcoming offerings. Jessica, jump on in.
Thank you so much. So wanted to remind everyone that Monday, September 16th is the last day to submit a proposal to present at CalSPRA 2025, which is in San Diego, March 5th through 8th. So please submit your proposals by Monday. We also have another conference callback coming up on September 25th, which is on the value of youth voter education. And then the last thing I wanted to remind everyone of is our office hours in September, which is on September 27th. And you can come and ask questions, just talk with people that know what you do and know how hard it is. Just want to wish everyone a great day. I know it's been a tough week for school PR people this week and today especially. So please keep continuing to talk to one another on the listserv and reach out for help. And thanks for all being here today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic weekend.